they had this idea that this approach might help, people with autism. And, it had already been, ketogenic diets had been used already for, well, now it's over 100 years that they've been used to treat drug-resistant epilepsy very successfully. About 25% of children mostly, but some adults now, have found very helpful. About 25% will they'll have a complete elimination of their seizures as long as they stay on the ketogenic diet. And then another 50% will have, between like half and 90% of their seizures, reduced, the numbers of seizures that they have, so that's been around for a long time. So theoretically, it's been known that this could help in some neurological diseases, but now they were extending this idea, because of this, knowing that insulin resistance, trouble getting glucose into the brain, is part of Alzheimer's, but it's also part of many other neurodegenerative diseases and diseases like autism. And even now we're finding out psychiatric disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, respond to ketogenic diets. People improve dramatically on a ketogenic diet. This is kind of a newer area that's being explored.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to our next episode of Reimagine Wellness, the podcast produced by metabolichealth.com. We have the pleasure of interviewing so many well-respected experts in the field of metabolic health, and today is no different. We're joined today with Dr. Mary Newport. Dr. Newport got her career originally in neonatology, pediatric intensive care unit for neonatal infants, so very high stakes, stressful kind of environment, and also requires a generalist career skill set it's interesting, and that definitely allows you to think quickly on your feet and think of human biology from a systems perspective, which I think is very helpful for metabolic health. Since starting your career in neonatology, though, you've sort of pivoted more, particularly in the last decade and a half or so, in response to some personal challenges. And you've been able to help those very close to you enjoy better quality of life through the struggle of Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia. And we're just so grateful to have you on today to talk about metabolic health and particularly how it might influence our neurology and things like neurodegenerative conditions. So with that, we want to welcome you, Dr. Newport. Again, thank you so much for joining. Thank you, everyone else, for tuning in and watching this. And we think it'd be good to just get started with sort of a brief introduction. Again, like how'd you get into medicine, the particular field of medicine you chose, what was that period of practice like, and then leading up into your more recent work. We'd love to hear a background on you.
Oh, okay. Well, I became interested in being a physician when I was about 10 years old. Up to that point, I didn't know that women could be physicians. And I had thought about being a nurse, a teacher, that kind of thing, the usual. And I broke my arm and I spent a night in a hospital. I had to be put to sleep to, fix it. And I was so curious about the other children on the unit that I walked from room to room to room, asking them what was wrong with them. I was just totally fascinated. And then not long after that, we had a bookmobile at my school, and I could take out 4 or 5 books. And I spotted one that said, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first American woman physician. I was like, what? A woman can be a doctor? And, I read the book. I was totally fascinated. And for a long time, I still told people I wanted to be a nurse, but I secretly wanted to be a doctor. And I remember when I told my mom, she was pretty excited, but she said, well, women doctors can't get married and have children. That was a belief at the time. It was really rare. At my high school, it had been at least 20 years since a woman had gone to medical school from all girls high school that I went to. So it was unusual. But then when I looked into it, there were other women. And when I did go to medical school, but only 9% of our class were women. There were 14 out of 200 roughly. So I think that's less than 9%, that were women. And now it's at least 50-50. So it was, I went to basically the first year that Xavier University went co-ed. It had been a male school up until the year that I started. It was a great pre-med program. So I was one of 50 women with 2,000 men there, and then mostly men in medical school. So it was new for women to be in medicine. And so then I did I decided I wanted to do pediatrics, and I did 3 years of pediatric training. But I really enjoyed, well, my favorite thing was the newborn intensive care unit. At first, it was pretty scary because babies are very critical, and some babies don't make it. And it was heartbreaking, when that happened. But I just felt like it was very satisfying to help a newborn into the world, help them start breathing, take care of them in that way, and then, send them home with their families. To me, that was just extraordinary. And so I decided to do a fellowship in neonatology. That was 2 years. And then started practicing medicine after that. And we had gone from Cincinnati, where I grew up, and went to medical school, to and did my initial pediatric training. And then we went to Charleston, South Carolina, and then we decided it was still too cold, so we came on down to Florida when it was time to get a job. And I've been in Florida ever since. We did 30. I spent 30 years in newborn intensive care units. I got to start 2 new newborn intensive care units. It was relatively a new field when I started in 1978 is when I graduated from medical school. So that was a long time ago. And there were a lot of, areas that really didn't have a newborn intensive care unit yet. And babies would have to be transferred from, local hospitals to larger hospitals. So that it was just really a very rewarding thing for me. And so I did that for 30 years. But what got me into the opposite end of, the spectrum was what happened to my husband. My husband, Steve, we got married actually when I was a sophomore in college. I was 20. He was 22. He had graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Business, and he was an accountant. And when it came time for me to go into practice, we also wanted to have children, and we were really worried, because of the emergency nature of my job and the long hours, that it would be really hard, and if he was working full time too, when would our children ever see us? So he made a decision. He said, well, why doesn't he stay home and work from home, which was really unusual. That was in 1982, that we had our first child. And he became the accountant for my practice when I finished, all of my training. And he was the accountant, business manager, and he was able to completely work from home because the job that I had was hospital based. I worked strictly in the hospital. And Steve, he was a very active guy. He would kayak out to little islands off the coast, where we lived here in Florida, constantly reading. He was always on a computer. He always had to have the fastest, latest computer. Did his accounting work all day. He would play on it all night. No, I don't know. He loved Tetris and all that, and he just wasn't somebody you would think was going to get Alzheimer's disease. But when he was 51, he started doing some strange things. He'd forget appointments, for our daughters, for example. I would call him because I knew he was having some weird issue with remembering. I would call him from my work and remind him that the girls had an appointment in 30 minutes, and he would still forget. And he started doing things. He would hang Post-its on a piece of tape in doorways to try to remind him about stuff, constantly losing his keys in his wallet, and more than just losing them. Like really, really lose them. And then he started forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And at this point he was 51. And I'm like, I was 49, and like, that's not normal. I would remember if I'd been to the bank and the post office. And so we got him to see a neuropsychiatrist, and the doctor mentioned dementia, but Steve was having some issues with depression, and the doctor felt that he said memory problems can be related to depression. So he really felt that it was the depression that was a problem, that at that point he didn't think it was dementia. Put him on antidepressants, but he steadily got worse. He got worse. And at 54, he was officially diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, which was just shocking. It was shocking to us. He had, there's a test called the mini mental status exam. It's 30 points. There's another similar one called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. They're both 30 points. And, if you miss 1 point, 1 or 2 points, that's considered normal. But in this case, he had scored 23 out of 30. And there was a drawing where you draw, you have to copy it, but it's trapezoids that are interlocking. It's a little bit of a complex. That figure was all over the place. It didn't look remotely like what it should have looked like. And when I saw that, I was pretty shocked. I mean, we just didn't really dream he'd have dementia, but it changed everything. And he was always aware of it. I mean, I always knew that he had it and what he had been able to do and what he couldn't do. And we just saw everything slowly erode. His accounting skills, by the time he was 56, he could no longer even remember how to use a mouse, much less turn on a computer or use a calculator, and these were things he had been just routinely doing. It was just heartbreaking. And I knew I was going to lose him, we weren't going to get to retire together and all of that. So, constantly looking for what could we do? I was always looking at the latest research, trying to get him into a clinical trial. And we just didn't have many that were coming up in our area. And, by 2006, he, no more accounting, couldn't do anything, had to stop driving. He got lost. He ended up on the other coast of Florida one day, like 3 hours away on the other coast. And that was an ordeal. Luckily, he could remember how to use a cell phone at that point. And, so then we kind of fast forward to 2008, and he could hardly finish a sentence. He had a lot of symptoms that you would also see with Parkinson's disease, some stiffness in how he walked. He couldn't pick his feet up and run anymore. He had tremors in his hand and in his jaw. It turned out that he had, I think you mentioned this, Alzheimer's and Lewy body dementia. We found out he donated his brain, and we found out for certain that was what he had. But we were pretty desperate. I really felt like he was going downhill so fast that I would probably lose him within 2 or 3 years. And we got very lucky that 2 clinical trials came along at the same time in our area. There hadn't been any for a few years. And I signed him up to try out for both trials 2 days in a row. And the night before the first screening, I got online to look at the risks and benefits of the 2 drugs. And just by chance, up pops a press release about a medical food that was still a year away from coming out, but it was going through, phase 2 testing to become a medical food. That was their goal. And they had done 2 studies. The first was a pilot study of 20 people, and they got a drink on one day, and they got a placebo on another day when they came in. And these were people with Alzheimer's, and 9 out of 20 people had improved cognitive testing after they took the drink, after they got the actual drink. And they didn't really, and then they had done a longer study. It was 3 months that people were taking this, and it held up. It was 152 people this time, and almost half of them had improved cognitive testing, and it maintained, over 6 months that they were improved during that time, people that extended to 6 months. And I thought, well, what is this? And I found their patent application online. It was really informative. It was a whole area of Alzheimer's research that I had not come across, that Alzheimer's is a type of diabetes of the brain. There's a problem with glucose uptake into the areas of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's. And they talk about an alternative fuel for the brain, ketones, and that Dr. Richard Beach at the NIH had in the 90s, since the 90s, she'd been studying this and had hypothesized that ketones could bypass this problem of insulin resistance that was keeping glucose from getting into the brain and into brain cells, and could provide fuel to the brain and potentially help somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And their medical food was MCT oil. And this is an oil that's extracted from usually coconut oil. Palm kernel oil also contains these medium chain triglycerides. And when you consume them, no matter what you eat, some of that is going to be converted to ketones. And it was a brilliant idea. I thought, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. I remembered, that during starvation, you start putting out ketones. After you use up the glucose in your body, you start breaking down fat, you start putting out ketones, and the brain uses that as fuel in place of glucose. And then I also remembered that MCT oil is converted to ketones. So, the basis of it was sound. I thought, okay, this makes sense. And we've got to try this. So, but I'm reading about this at like 1 a.m. and he's scheduled for screening at 9 a.m. and I couldn't do anything about it. So we ended up having a day before and a day of starting coconut oil testing for him. And so we go to for the clinical trial testing. Couldn't give him any MCT oil or coconut oil. And he did not do well. He scored this time only 14 out of 30 points on that mini mental status. So that's how far down he had gone, during that period of time. And he needed 16 to qualify. So he was 2 points shy of qualifying. And we were devastated. And the doctor asked him to draw a clock, which is a standard test for Alzheimer's disease. And I can show you a picture of it. Let's see if you can see it on there. So I have to, can you see?
I can see it a little bit. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, gosh. It's hard to get it right in the middle of that little screen. But anyway, it's like a few circles, just a few little circles and a few numbers, like 4 numbers. It's very disorganized. I mean, it doesn't look like a clock. Nobody would look at that and say it's a clock. So the doctor told me that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, which I really kind of knew already. And I thought, well, what do we have to lose, And I didn't know you could get MCT oil in, like health food stores. And it turned out bodybuilders had been using it since like the 1970s and 80s for increase their lean body mass. So it was actually on Amazon. It was in stores, but I didn't know that at that point. But I had read, in the patent application that it was extracted from coconut oil. And so we picked up some coconut oil on the way home, and I got on the internet and I refreshed my memory about which were the medium chain triglycerides. And then I found a fatty acid composition of coconut oil on the USDA website, Food Data Central. You can look up any food and see what the breakdown is. And it was 60%, 60% medium chain triglycerides. And these are C6 to C12, so these are fatty acids, for people that don't know, they're made up like little strings of carbons, like a pearl necklace in a way. And attached to the carbons are hydrogen. And then at one end, there's some oxygen also attached to it. And they're named by how many carbons are in the chain, so medium chain triglycerides are considered up to 12 carbons, or C12. So they'll call the fatty acid C8, C10, C12, based on how many carbons there are. And long chain fatty acids, which are in most other oils, like everyday oils, soybean, olive oil, peanut oil, safflower oil, all of those are C16 and above usually. They're at least 16. And but coconut oil is loaded with these medium chain triglycerides, and these other everyday oils don't have any in it. The only other thing that has substantial amount of medium chain triglycerides are the milk of mammals, including humans. Has quite a lot of medium chain triglycerides in it. And that's, I feel that that's important, because if a newborn, if I feel like whatever is in breast milk, that's naturally produced in breast milk is likely needed for the growth and development of the infant. It makes sense. And these medium chain triglycerides in human breast milk and in cow milk and goat milk and all of that, are there for a reason. And the interesting thing, one reason that I was familiar with MCT oil at all is because I am a neonatologist. I did newborn intensive care. And back in the 1980s, we used to add MCT oil to the feedings of our tiniest preemies, babies that were under 2 pounds. We would add a little bit to each feeding, and they would grow faster and they'd get home faster. And they started then adding it to premature infant formulas and then full-term infant formulas. And they started adding MCT oil, but also coconut oil to these formulas. And the reason they were doing that was to try to mimic the fats that are in human breast milk, to try to make the formula as close to breast milk as possible. So, I felt like, okay, this is a very good reason. And it's in infant formulas. How could it be harmful to somebody with Alzheimer's disease, and it's basically almost every commercial infant formula to this day has coconut oil, sometimes palm kernel oil instead. And many of them also have MCT oil in it, to try to mimic human breast milk. So the next day, he was scheduled for 1:00 in the afternoon to have his test. The timing worked out really well. So I thought, well, we'll give him some of this for breakfast. And I had calculated how much coconut oil I needed to give them to equal the MCTs in that medical food, to give them the dose that they were using in their study. And they were using like a 20-gram dose, which is 4 teaspoons basically. And I came up with 7 teaspoons of coconut oil, which is a little over 2 tablespoons. And their product was actually just C8, was pure C8. At that early stage, I didn't know anything about C8, to be honest. But, I figured a medium chain triglyceride, based on how much medium chain triglyceride there was, that's what I came up with. So I put that in like some oatmeal. Coconut oil tends to be kind of semi-solid at room temperature, but it melts very quickly if you put it with anything warm. And so I mixed it in some oatmeal. And then about 4 hours later, we had gone to a different setting. It was a completely different city, a different facility, different group. And he had the same test, the mini mental status exam. And this time he gained 4 points. He scored 18 out of 30. He needed 16 to qualify. He qualified for the study. And we were just astounded. And he remembered things, that were like the day of the week, which was different, what city we were in, what floor in the facility. And he remembered the season, which he hadn't been able to remember the day before. So, it was pretty shocking. And I just, I wasn't sure if we had just gotten lucky or if this was real, but I thought we're going to keep it going. So on the way home from that, we picked up cookbooks. We went to health food stores and picked up coconut oil cookbooks. And there was a ton of information about coconut oil. And, I had always wondered why it was in health food stores, because I was taught in medical school it was an artery clogging fat, coconut oil, that it was not healthy, but it was in health food stores. So I was a little mystified, and I just started learning everything I could about coconut oil. And it was really eye-opening at the time, but I decided we're just going to keep it going. We're going to give him this every morning for breakfast. And then the thing in the patent application, the medical food, they were only using 1 dose a day. They recommended giving a dose in the morning, 20 grams, and none the rest of the day. But their studies showed that the ketone levels peaked at about 90 minutes on average, and we're gone back to baseline at 3 hours. I thought, you need brain, your brain needs fuel 24/7, not just for 3 hours. So I thought, why not just start using coconut oil as our main fat and give it to them with each meal, and, just spread it out, and there'd be a better chance that he'd have ketones available to his brain, most of the day and maybe through the night. So just like the very next day, I started doing that. We kept the 35 gram or a little over 2 tablespoon dose for breakfast, and then I just started adding it to other meals and cooking with it. And then we got coconut milk, which is mostly coconut oil, which was delicious, and just everything coconut. And he just steadily improved. He said the day he started coconut oil, it was like a light bulb came back on in his head. He said that his mood, which was depressed and even suicidal sometimes, lifted completely. He had hope for his future again. There were some real obvious things just the first couple of days. He normally, like in the morning, when he first come out, from the bedroom, to the kitchen, he would walk very slow, barely talk, couldn't figure out, how to use the water dispenser from the refrigerator, couldn't get the right utensil out of the drawer. If he wanted to use a spoon, he'd keep getting a knife or something like that. And he couldn't finish sentences. And he had these tremors in his hand and in his jaw when he talked. And when he'd get the coconut, after he started that, within a couple of days, he was bouncing down the hall. He was smiling, he was joking, he was whistling again. He could find the spoon, he could get the water, just some things like that happened fairly quickly. His jaw tremor completely disappeared. We never saw that again. His hand tremor would be there in the morning until he got the coconut oil. In about 20 or 30 minutes, that would go away. And if it came up other times of the day, like one time after we had met Dominic D'Agostino, Dr. D'Agostino from University of South Florida, who's really into ketones. You guys have probably know a lot about him. We had lunch with him, and Steve, his tremor kind of started, but I always brought coconut and with me, and he had some of that in 20 or 30 minutes. The tremor was gone. And Dominic, he tells that story repeatedly, that he actually witnessed this, and that convinced him that this was very real. There are just some interesting things, like by 2 months, he could tie his shoes again, which he hadn't been able to do for a long time. And his gait improved. He was completely walking normally within 2 months, and he could pick his feet up and run again. And by that time, I had also started giving him MCT oil. I found out that I could get it. And Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH, I had started communicating with him. The first time I called him, he answered the phone himself. And, I told him, basically, after a couple of phone calls, I told him exactly what we were doing. My first call was like, do you think coconut oil could help somebody with Alzheimer's? This was about 2 weeks after it happened, or almost 2 weeks. And he said, oh, I don't think so. He said, this guy called me, he said, a few years before about MCT oil. And he said he just didn't really think the ketone levels could be high enough to help somebody with Alzheimer's. And he told me about his ketone ester that he was developing that could get ketone levels up to instantly up to 5 millimoles, which is really high for people that don't know, like most people on a typical diet, will have like a 0.1 or 0.2 ketone level. And this is 5 is like extraordinarily much higher. And nutritional ketosis is considered like at least 0.5, is what people will usually shoot for, or higher, aiming for 1 to 2, depending on why they're doing this. But he had this ester that could get extraordinarily high levels. And I was really interested in that. And he started sending me his hypothesis papers that they had written around 2001 to 2004. And he had not been able to get funding from the NIH, even though he worked there, to do clinical testing and to mass produce it, and the test for Alzheimer's. And there were so many other things he felt it would help people with Parkinson's, MS, Huntington's disease, and autism, but congestive heart failure, people recovering from heart attacks, because the heart, the fatty acids are actually preferred fuel of the heart, and they love ketones. The heart loves ketones. There's some newer research, showing that the heart and the kidneys eagerly take up ketones. So he had all these hypotheses, but it hadn't been tested except in animals yet. So when at about the 2-week point, Steve drew another clock, and this time it was a full circle. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it if you couldn't see the other one. too well, but here's like his
Okay. Yep.
working backwards. Nope, this way. Okay. Oh shoot, it's hard. The screen's like really little at this end.
Yeah, if you send me screenshots after our podcast too, I can blow it up.
There it is. Okay, that's his second clock. And you can see it's a full circle and it's got all the numbers are in there. There's a tremendous number of I thought they were hands of the clock. And then Steve told me later, he said he was trying to line up the numbers across from each other. He wanted it to be neat, to look tidy, and he wanted the numbers to line up. So that's what all those lines were about. But so I faxed that to Dr. Beach, and he called me back, and the two clocks, the first and the second, and he said, "Well, this is unexpected." He was really shocked, and he put me in touch with three other researchers that had co-written the hypothesis papers, and these were, really elderly men who had been working on this and talking about it for decades. And one of them was Dr. George Cahill Jr., who in the late 1960s, he was the one who studied starvation and found that the brain uses ketones during starvation to survive, so he had co-written papers with Dr. Beach. And then Dr. Theodore Van Italy, he was in the group that discovered that MCT oil is converted to ketones. This was also in the 1960s. So he had been writing hypothesis papers. And then Dr. Sammy Hashem, who worked with Dr. Van Italy, the two of them, they had extensively studied medium chain triglycerides, in the 60s and beyond. And it was just extraordinary to get to talk to these men, who had done all this work. And now they had this idea that this approach might help, people with autism. And, it had already been, ketogenic diets had been used already for, now it's over 100 years that they've been used to treat drug-resistant epilepsy very successfully. About 25% of children mostly, but some adults now, have found very helpful. About 25% will they'll have a complete elimination of their seizures as long as they stay on the ketogenic diet. And then another 50% will have, between like half and 90% of their seizures, reduced, the numbers of seizures that they have, so that's been around for a long time. So theoretically, it's been known that this could help in some neurological diseases, but now they were extending this idea, because of this, knowing that insulin resistance, trouble getting glucose into the brain, is part of Alzheimer's, but it's also part of many other neurodegenerative diseases and diseases like autism. And even now we're finding out psychiatric disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, respond to ketogenic diets. People improve dramatically on a ketogenic diet. This is kind of a newer area that's being explored. And, it can decrease depression and anxiety, which an awful lot of people are dealing with. So it was, just really quite a journey with learning about ketones and becoming interested. And at the same time, I'm working as a newborn intensive care specialist. I'm thinking about newborns and how this could potentially help, babies. And, I was very frustrated because I was working at a community hospital, but I was employed by a children's hospital that had major research going on. And I tried repeatedly to let me do some studies, just simply like a baby. Sometimes a baby will have like a cord wrapped around their neck several times. They'll be asphyxiated when they're born. Their brain hasn't been getting enough oxygen, and they can, suffer severe brain damage, unless that situation is corrected really quickly. And I thought, well, we could give them MCT oil, just put it in a tube down their stomach. We often feed babies that way when they can't suck normally. It's called gavage feeding. And, maybe we can preserve, some of the damage that happens to their brain, by providing this fuel to the brain. I couldn't get approval to do the research. It was very frustrating. But so then I'm, kind of doing both at that point of my life. And this was 2008, when my husband started taking the coconut oil and improved so much. So it became like a complete obsession. I guess you could say, of mine. I'm thinking my husband has improved. This is a medical food that's not going to come out for a year, but it's on the shelf. In fact, C8 as an MCT oil was on the shelf. It was already on the shelf. You could buy it, from a fitness company. And there were other companies that were making MCT oil, and many, and some companies making coconut oil that was available. So it became my obsession to tell as many people as possible. At that point, they were saying there are 35 million people in the world with Alzheimer's disease, and I knew other people would improve if my husband improved, and why should they have to wait for an expensive medical food that people would have to go to their doctor to have it prescribed, and when it was on the shelf. So I just started writing. I wrote to 2008 was an election year, so I wrote to all the politicians who were involved. I wrote to all the major news outlets, and really got no response. I wrote up a case, basically there's a medical food that's going to come out. This is how it works. It's on the shelf and people need to know about it. You need to get your medical people on this, your scientists, and study this urgently. That was, I always said, I know my husband has only one case, but there are these other studies that have been done in which other people with Alzheimer's improved. And my sister suggested that I write to Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice O'Connor. Her husband was well known at the time that he was suffering with Alzheimer's, and she had become part of an Alzheimer's study group that was organized by the government, kind of in collaboration with the Alzheimer's Association. And she was a perfect person to write to. So I wrote this really long letter when I look at it, about all of that, trying to get them to study it. And I just didn't get a response. Nobody would respond. And so, basically about 2 months after this happened with my husband, that he started taking coconut oil, the Alzheimer's Association was going to have a conference in Chicago. This would have been July of 2008. And I thought, I'll write up a case report. And so I just kind of wrote it up, telling the story and about the ketone ester, that the levels could be much higher, that it needed funding, And I arranged to have a table in the exhibit hall at their conference. These conferences, especially this one, they have massive exhibit halls, so they have all the drug companies are there, and they have huge exhibits. They give out all kinds of nifty things to doctors when you're there, and researchers. But they also had smaller exhibits, like I could have a table and I could distribute the article. And I sent them the article. They approved it. They took my money for it. And then I had 1,500 copies of this little case report I'd written up, printed in Chicago. My sister and her husband were going to come with us and, hang out with Steve, and they were going to hang out at the booth while I went to the conference. And about 3 days before the Alzheimer's Association, they contacted me and said, well, we changed our mind and we're not going to let you have a table. And they gave me a refund, so I did get my money back, but they said, you can come to the conference, but you can't pass out your case report. It has to be peer reviewed. We can't, and I argued back and forth with them, and they just wouldn't, they wouldn't let me do it, but we did go. And there were 1,500 copies there in Chicago. And I managed to, I went to, they probably had about 2,500 poster presentations over 5 days. And I went, to look at all of those, and anybody that had anything to do with nutrition, insulin, anything at all, glucose or insulin, I would stop and talk to them. Oh, fatty acids, that kind of thing. And I would slip them a copy of my little case report. So I think I gave about 200 out there. And my sister, she did her best, kind of outside the facility. They were passing them out to people in Grant Park there and all that kind of thing. And it was quite an experience, but, it was obvious. Oh, and another funny thing that happened, they had a press room, and my sister found it. And she said, oh, you've got to come down here and see the press room and talk to them. And So I tried to bring my case report there, to the press room. And they said, we're sorry, we can't accept anything that wasn't peer reviewed or approved by. But out in the hall, this reporter, she said, so what's your story? Why are you here? And so I told her all about it. I gave her a copy of it. And she says, oh, we're filming a little documentary about this. Would you like to be on it? I'm like, yeah. So it was a documentary called A Journey Through Alzheimer's. And so our story, Steve's clocks, everything, was on it. And, we were one of I think about 8 different people that they interviewed, for this documentary. So I'm sure the Alzheimer's Association wasn't too happy about that, but too bad, I just felt like, scientific basis was there. The people that had the medical food, it was called Axona at the time, they had a booth there. They had an exhibit. So they were aware of it, of the idea. But they just, I talked to their medical director at one point and different people and just could not convince them to make people aware of this, that this is a possible treatment. I mean, and it was a food. It wasn't that it was a toxic drug. It was a food. So, it was very frustrating that I couldn't get them to even listen to it, much less were they going to fund anything, and at that time they didn't. But a few years later, they did start funding some MCT oil studies and some studies of ketogenic diet. And they featured it. They had several sessions beginning around 2017. They had sessions on ketones and, these ketogenic strategies, MCT oil, ketogenic diets, that kind of thing. And this past summer, though, I got to go to Amsterdam and I had 2 poster presentations. They accepted that. And I got to present, one poster was on ketogenic strategies for people with Alzheimer's and other memory impairment. So I could go down the list of different things that can put you into ketosis that people can use alone or in combination, which we can talk about in a minute. And the other poster was a collection of 288 cases of people with memory impairment, Alzheimer's or other memory impairment, who had taken coconut or MCT oil, and they had written to me. They had sent me an email. So they're all like anecdotal reports, and, I couldn't verify their medical records or anything like that, but they accepted it. And, it showed, I think people were more likely to write to me if they had a positive response, than if they didn't. But I did have people that wrote and say, we saw absolutely no response. So about 10% said they didn't see any change. And almost 90% said that they saw some kind of improvement. And, for about 2/3 of them, it was some kind of a cognitive improvement, their memory, how well they organize their day, their basic functions, that kind of thing. But, about 1/3 of them, had some kind of improvement in their, like Steve did, their mood, their behavior, that type of thing improved, their language skills, conversation, recognizing other people, some resumed hobbies again, like they started reading again. My husband was able to start reading again about 3.5 or 4 months. He hadn't been able to read for about 1.5 years, and he started reading again. There was one lady that started crocheting again. Well, she was like in bed and had stopped eating and didn't recognize her family. And she got up out of bed and she started reading the newspaper again and eating and recognizing everybody. And 6 months later, she was crocheting again, and they really thought she was going to die soon, when they started. And that was just coconut oil. It was incredible. So, it just, it was really interesting as it unfolded. And, and then, I started getting invitations to come to, we started leaving the extra copies that we had, which were many, in health food stores around our area, because they had coconut oil. And then they started inviting me to come and talk. And my husband would come and he would answer people's questions. He would tell them what it was like to have Alzheimer's disease. And then I got invited on a radio program, like a local program. And then our regional newspaper picked up on that, and they interviewed us. And they interviewed Dr. Veach along with it, and Dr. Van Italy. They talked about the ketone ester in it, in the story. And they had a picture of Steve and I with his, he had 3 clocks at that point, showing the progression, the improvement in his clock drawing. And that one went viral. They said it was one of their most popular stories ever, which was pretty neat. And but I started just getting a tremendous number of emails then, because people found the case report. We had put it out online, and it had my address and my home phone, my cell phone, and my email address on it. So people who wanted to find me did, and they still do. They still do. Some people they come across that article years later. This was 2008, that I first put that out online, and people find it, and they find me then. So it's been really an interesting journey. And I haven't let you ask any questions yet.
It's been fascinating. And the story, I think, provides interesting context. Like you talk, for example, about MCT oil being used in your neonatal clinic as a way to help babies gain weight. And that probably was a key event in sort of predisposing you or making you open to trying this, where some people maybe wouldn't be. I always find it interesting.
I knew what it was,
Yeah.
I used it in medical practice. I knew it existed.
It's used for that purpose, but then there seems to be some blocks with using it further beyond that. Something that I thought was interesting, because you mentioned breast milk and animal byproducts as a potential source of MCT as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of your focus has been on coconut oil. Are there some advantages in terms of like bioavailability, or is it like the actual processing of coconut oil in particular? Like it's easier to hit those critical concentrations for esters, such that it's favored as a area for exploration and research? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I know there's some differences between coconut and MCT oil, and I decided to take advantage of those differences by mixing them together for my husband, Steve. And I started doing this at about 6 weeks after Dr. Veach had said, let's measure his levels after he gets coconut oil. And he got 2 doses that day at breakfast and dinner. And he measured, we actually had his levels drawn at our local lab, and the manager agreed to they put him on liquid nitrogen, whatever that is. Anyway, and shipped them up to the NIH, so they could run the ketone levels. And then 2 weeks after that, they ran levels for the MCT oil. Steve just taking a 20-gram dose, like in the medical food of MCT oil. And then one of the other doctors that worked with me, Dr. Veach, wanted a control. So one of the other doctors was real interested in this, and so he also took MCT oil that day, and we could see that Steve's ketone levels were higher after he took the MCT oil, and it kind of peaked at 90 minutes and really was gone at 3 hours, just like they had found in their patent, with the people that they had studied. And but with the coconut oil, the peak level was lower. It was lower than MCT, but it didn't peak until 3 hours after. And there was still a little bit, from breakfast to dinner, there was still a little bit of a ketone level before he got the second dose, so it had kind of held up all day, even though it was low levels of ketones. And then after the dinner dose, his level went up to basically as high as it did with the MCT oil. This was about 3 hours after. And that was when we stopped measuring. The level was still rising, when we stopped measuring it. So it seemed like there was something about getting that second dose, and something about the evening. It could be a hormonal thing, that his levels got quite a bit higher in the evening. So I thought, well, if we mix them together, we can take advantage of the higher peak level with the MCT oil and the longer duration with the coconut oil. And maybe this will provide ketones 24/7. That was my goal. And so I just started doing that, and just kind of slowly adding the MCT. A lot of people don't tolerate MCT oil, if you take too much too fast. And the same is true with coconut oil. Some people will have, to put this politely, diarrhea, explosive diarrhea.
Any fat, really, right?
Yeah, and it can go on for an hour.
Yeah.
If you're not used to it, that happens. Like about a quarter of people will have an experience like that if they try to take too much right away. So we were just really lucky that that didn't happen to Steve. And I took over 2 tablespoons too that first day of coconut oil, and my gallbladder was removed years ago, and I got major indigestion, after I did that. So I just backed off and I just started with a little bit. Now I can eat as much as I want, and I don't have that problem. You just have to slowly build up to it, because even without a gallbladder, your liver will still make those enzymes that you need to break down the fat. It just needs to learn how to make more of it when you eat more fat. It's a gradually increasing. It works really well in that regard. But okay, so what are we now? What?
I would just add on to that. I think it's interesting the sort of differences between the more concentrated MCT and the coconut oil.
Yeah.
From hearing that, I would think maybe it has something to do with the fat concentration slowing down the breakdown of the MCT oil into your body. And I was also curious because when you talked about the alleviation of Steve's symptoms, you talked about some things were remedied almost immediately, or the MCT or the coconut oil was metabolized and you saw an improvement there and then. And then other things were more of like a progressive improvement, like the walking ability. And what that makes me think of potentially also is subcutaneous fat and its role as an anti-inflammation mechanism, plus giving the brain nutrition on a consistent basis, allowing it to reform neuron connections that weren't there before. I don't know if you have any theories as far as like those things that took a little bit longer to get better as opposed to the immediate improvements, what might have been at play there.
Yeah, I do. I totally agree with that. Coconut oil is a fascinating substance. It's a fascinating food because it has so many different compounds in it. It's not just fat. It has a lot of polyphenols, and they're anti-inflammatory, antioxidant type polyphenols. They found substances that help prevent the buildup of plaques in the brain, which is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, or they thought it was for many years. And each fatty acid has special biological properties. And so if you just take C8, the main thing that we know about C8 is that it is highly ketogenic. It's the most, well, C6 is also very ketogenic, but it tastes horrible. So they haven't been able to figure out how to use that in an MCT oil product. So C8 is ketogenic, and that medical food was just C8, but C10, they have learned recently, has anticonvulsant properties. It's on par with one of the common anticonvulsants that are used, valproic acid, with how efficient it is at controlling seizures. And then the other thing about C10 is it stimulates mitochondria to multiply. And for people that don't know, mitochondria there's hundreds of them in brain cells, and in the heart, cells in the heart, like all cells, most cells have mitochondria to produce ATP, the energy that kind of helps the cells carry out their functions. And, basically mitochondria they multiply when you consume C10. And that's an advantage because you're going to make more energy, more ATP, with more mitochondria in a cell. So that's got two very interesting property. It's ketogenic, but it happens more slowly than C8. Okay, C12, lauric acid, is half of the fat in coconut oil. And C12 is intriguing because they have known for decades that it's antimicrobial. It kills many different kinds of bacteria, fungus. It kills dental pathogens, which have been implicated with Alzheimer's disease. It kills spirochetes. It kills fungus. It kills all protozoa, all kinds of organisms. And if you look at the ingredients of like antiviral wipes or an antiviral spray, you'll see sodium lauryl sulfate, and that's lauric acid. It's the companies that process coconut oil in the Philippines and Thailand, they'll often, they sell the whole oil, but they'll also separate it into its components, the fatty acids. And lauric acid is sold for its antimicrobial properties. It's used by companies, to make these viral disinfectant kind of things. It's used in veterinary applications to help control infections in animals. It's a very interesting compound in that way. And there are like hundreds of studies, showing implicating different organisms as possible causes or contributors to Alzheimer's disease. Herpes simplex virus, which is in the fever blisters that people will get in their mouth. Those that virus lives in the nerves, and those nerves start in the brain, right near where Alzheimer's begins. Herpes simplex virus, and there are at least 200 studies connecting, showing a possible connection between herpes simplex virus and development of Alzheimer's disease. That kind of thing. So lauric acid could potentially be controlling an infection. And, I had a suspicion that herpes simplex might play a role in my husband, why he got it so early. He constantly had fever blisters. He would always have we have so many photos where he has a fever blister on his mouth. And, he would have it for, a week or 10 days. It would go away for a week or so, and then it would come back. And this was just something his whole adult life. And when he was 29, he developed an outbreak around his eye. And the eye is a portal directly to the brain, and he was really sick. He couldn't sit up. He couldn't eat, and he might have had a mild herpes encephalitis, an inflammation in the brain from it. And he said he never felt the same after that, that he didn't feel like he functioned as well in his job, after that happened. And that was at age 29. And now there's studies, showing that infections from decades earlier might cause Alzheimer's later. And it's one of those viruses, it doesn't leave you. It just lives in the nerves and it breaks out periodically. And something like that can break out, and it could break out in the brain. You might not even see it on your mouth, but lauric acid, to have that, you're eating it all the time. You have a level of lauric acid, it's antimicrobial. It could potentially control an infection. And in Steve's case, it was, he lived for another 8 years after that. He only had 4 times when he had the tiniest little fever blister in that 8 years after we started giving him coconut oil. So, and when he did have an outbreak, that's when we would see a setback too. We would see increased symptoms. So I felt like lauric acid was controlling an infection that might be contributing. And controlling an infection also helps control inflammation. And then, these polyphenol substances in coconut oil also can help control inflammation in the brain. I just felt like the acute effects were most likely from ketones, things that happened like immediately were fuel related. I just felt like they had to be fuel related. I mean, to improve on your memory testing a few hours later, that had to be fuel somehow, allowing the neurons that are involved in that, be able to function normally. And that the other things may have controlled other pathologies that are happening in Alzheimer's disease, controlling the inflammation in the brain. And then, I feel like there's value to MCT oil, but I feel like coconut, I always encourage people to use both unless they really can't, some people they can't stand the taste of coconut oil, and you can get it deodorized. I usually tell people to get organic, unrefined, because all of those polyphenols, they'll still be in the oil. There's a they call it cold pressed or expeller pressed, that uses low heat. And it doesn't, cause these other substances to deteriorate. It doesn't remove the other substances, but when it's refined, some of that does go away. But some people really can't stand the fragrance, which is a mystery to me, but because I love it. But so I tell them, well, the next best thing would be to use, I guess, a refined coconut oil. You'll still get the ketogenic effect. The fatty acid composition stays the same, and those fatty acids will still do what they normally do. You just might not get the benefit of these other anti-inflammatory things and antimicrobial things. Well, the other cool thing about C12 that I didn't mention yet is that there's a company in Japan. They became really interested in how my husband could have improved so much with coconut oil, even though the ketone levels are on the low side. And they found that they did studies with astrocytes, and these are cells in the brain that nourish the neurons. And they did it in cultures of astrocytes, and they found that lauric acid directly stimulated ketone production in astrocytes. So but believe it or not, I haven't been able to find a single paper showing whether C12 crosses the blood-brain barrier or not. I suspect that it does, and I strongly suspect that could explain how somebody with low levels of ketones could improve so much when taking coconut oil, that it has a more direct effect in the brain. I have a few people who could actually do that kind of research that I've been kind of pushing, to do this. If you could just show that it crosses the blood-brain barrier, that it shows up in the brain, then okay, that could provide the answer to that question. I just feel like, getting the levels higher with MCT oil can be beneficial, but the other components of coconut oil could be as well, and so I teach people how to mix it, and anyway.
Dr. Newport, I know you mentioned the ester that was being studied, but wasn't out yet. Do you know what the fate of that has been? Has that come out yet? And does it actually get people's ketone levels to, I think you said level 5?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because yes. So, Dr. Veach, he was amazing. He's a really unique individual, and he was working on it. I wrote my first book to try to get funding for him. I wanted to get this out there. People could improve with coconut and MCT oil, but you can get much higher levels with this ketone ester. And in 2010, so 2 years, almost exactly 2 years after Steve started the coconut and MCT oil, Dr. Veach, they had finished toxicity testing on his ketone ester, human testing, and it passed. There were very few adverse effects, and it was mostly upset stomach, like 2,000 doses and 6 people had an upset stomach. I mean, it really was very well tolerated, and it really did get the ketone levels up. And Steve had gotten into one of those clinical trials. Well, he actually got into both. He tested again, and his mini mental status score went up to 20 the second time he tested for one of them, and he got accepted into both studies. And so we had to choose, and we chose this oral medication called semaglutide, and I regret that we put him in the study, which you'll understand in a minute. But so we found out later he was on placebo the first 18 months of the study, and which was good, but we didn't know it. We didn't know it until after he had left the study that he was on the placebo. So then I knew for sure, he had already improved a lot over that first 2 months before he went in the study. But then he was in a study, and it was hard to know for sure were the continued improvements related just to coconut and MCT oil, or was it this miracle drug, for Alzheimer's? And but he was on the placebo, and then it was a crossover study. So he switched over to the drug, and this was at the beginning of 2010, and he was on it for probably about 6 weeks, and he started having really strange side effects. And one was his hair started growing out like kind of a gold white color, and that was a known complication or effect of this drug. The people at the research center, since I was a doctor, they told me more than they did the average patient, but they could tell who was on it because most people, their hair would grow out, a different color. And then when his started growing out, it got out about a ½ inch or so. But he started having wounds that wouldn't heal. He got an abrasion on his shin that was, about this big. A month later, it still wasn't healed. And he would nick himself shaving. It would bleed for a few days, keep bleeding. And he fainted. And there was an enzyme a CPK enzyme that can go up and this was a drug they were worried might affect your heart. And that's one of the cardiac enzymes. We were, became really concerned, and we were about to head out of the country to Greece, for a conference I'd gotten invited to speak at, the Alzheimer's Disease International Conference. He was coming with me, and thought, what if we have a problem over there? So we actually dropped out of the study. And he had a setback. I mean, he started doing some new things and reverting back to some old problems that he had. And then we stopped the study. He was probably on the drug for about 6 weeks. And a few months later, they told us that they had stopped the study because when they analyzed the initial results, they found that the drug accelerated Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was horrible. And it explained, what had happened to him, the setback that he had. And we were just fortunate that he was only on it for 6 weeks and that he didn't get it at the beginning, that he wasn't on it all that time. The people at the research center, then they shared with me later, that there were the people that they thought were on it because of the color change in their hair had gotten much worse, during that time that they were on it, which was just, really sad. But Dr. Veach, I always kept him up to date. He said, well, my ketone ester, his ketone ester had passed toxicity testing, and he had taken it himself for a year. He wanted to do that to make sure it wouldn't kill somebody. I mean, he had quite a sense of humor. And he said, how about if Steve becomes the first person with Alzheimer's? We'll do a study, a pilot study. He'll be the first person with Alzheimer's to take this. And you can imagine we were really excited about this. And so his chemist, Todd King, made it drop by drop in their lab, which is how they were making it. And he sent me this ocean spray container full of this raw material that tasted horrible. It was the most horrible tasting stuff. And he suggested that I dilute it like 4-to-1 with water and try to add some kind of flavoring to it. He had a couple of ideas that I tried so many different flavors, and it was just horrible. It was awful. It didn't work. But anyway, Steve was a trooper, and he took it, and he would shudder every time he took it. And he was taking a hefty dose. Dr. Veach, he thought he was giving him half the dose he would need. And he was giving him 25 grams 3 times a day, which is a lot. It's a lot. I mean, like people now, like an athlete might take 25 grams, before an event or before a workout or something like that, but Steve was getting this 3 times a day. And we measured his ketone levels, often. By then they had the little handheld monitors available. And just to try to find out how much he needed to get him up to 4 or 5 millimoles. And it was like a 25 gram dose. So he was getting that 3 times a day. And like right away, like the first time he took it, I videotaped him. I've got it, videotape for about 2 hours. And he, for the first time in a long time, he sang the alphabet. He was trying to write it, and then he started trying to sing it. He thought maybe he'd remember it. It would come back, and it did. It took about 20 minutes, and he kept trying to write it, and then he sang it, and then he wrote. He did it in 20 minutes. He wrote out the whole alphabet, and he sang it, and he was really happy. And he just had this, kind of euphoria, which is one of the side effects of ketone ester that some people report. And he had like part of his setback was that he started needing a lot more help. I had to start talking him through things like taking a shower. You can imagine you've done this all your life, and now you can't remember how to take a shower, Yeah. So I'd stand there with him. I'd say, okay, get your hair wet. Okay, now put the shampoo in your hair. Okay, rub it in. Okay, scrub it around. Okay, now rinse it off. Talk him through each step of the way. And I had to do that with shaving, with helping him get dressed. The next day he took a shower. He picked out his clothes. He put them on. He shaved. And he did all that. I didn't even know he was doing this when he had gotten up, out of bed, and he comes out in the kitchen all dressed and all ready to go for the day. And so, that had to be ketone. I mean, ketone related.
Oh yeah.
So, so he stayed on it. He ended up being on it for, basically the rest of his life. And all the new things that we saw happen over that period of time all reversed. He kind of went back to square one, the improvement square one, after about 6 weeks of being on the ester.
Wow.
And then he was stable for another 20 months, before he had another setback. And between the coconut and MCT oil and the ketone ester, it was almost 4 years of improvement, where he was better than he was the year before he started the coconut oil. And I kind of liken it to cancer. If you got 4 more extra years of survival, that's a big deal. I mean, even 6 months extra is considered a big deal in the world of cancer treatments. And, so that was really something. And, what happened with Steve was that he had a seizure for the first time, even though he had taken the ketone ester. Like an hour and a half before that, I had a lady that she would stay with him when I went to work. Sybil, she was amazing. And he had hugged me, told me he loved me, kissed me goodbye. I go to work. 5 minutes later, she calls me and she said she had just called 911 because he had had a seizure. He fell back and hit his head. He stopped breathing. He turned blue. And she was having to, keep him breathing. And I, got back as quickly as I could. It was a few minutes from the hospital. Luckily, I was close by. I got there before EMS did. He was still blue when I got home. And his first seizure lasted about 20 minutes. And then he had another one on the way to the hospital. And he became completely dependent after that. It completely changed everything. And, even though he got his coconut and MCT and ketones, he had some improvement, after that, but not much. And he passed away about 2.5 years after that, and directly from Alzheimer's disease. And, for people that don't know, what happens with Alzheimer's, it's just a gradual process where you do become completely dependent like an infant. I mean, every single thing needs to be done for you. This happens with other neurodegenerative diseases too. And then at some point you stop eating and drinking, you forget how to swallow, literally. And, that's basically what happened, and he did pass away from Alzheimer's, and he donated his brain, and we found out he also had Lewy body dementia, which is very similar to Parkinson's disease. And people with the early onset Alzheimer's, it's pretty common to have a combination of those two. And I truly believe that, when somebody gets a neurodegenerative disease like this early, that an infection, I think there's a really strong likelihood that an infection is pushing that along, either causing it or contributing to it in some way. In his case, I really strongly suspect it was that herpes simplex virus, that he had an infection he had around his eye that probably was the ultimate trigger, for that.
And you think that was probably the trigger for the seizures as well?
Herpes simplex. It does trigger seizures. Alzheimer's. It's associated with Alzheimer's, but herpes simplex is associated with Alzheimer's. In a newborn, when a newborn has a seizure, the most common cause is herpes simplex infection.
Wow.
That they'll pick up from the mom, during the course of delivery, usually.
And that. Oh, sorry. I was going to.
I think it could be connected to autism too.
Wow. That ester that you had him on in the latter years of his life, is that being incorporated into current Alzheimer's treatment protocols?
Well, a lot of people are using it that way. So it is out. You had asked, is it out? Yeah, it's been out since 2018. There are a couple of products. So Dr. Veach, sadly, he passed away in 2020, right at the beginning of 2020. He was 84, still working at the NIH. He had gone to a conference and he died at home. He just died suddenly at home. But his ester had gotten out about 2 years before that in 2018. And Ketone Aid is the first one that came out, KE4. is the ester that my husband took. And it tastes a heck of a lot better.
Okay.
I mean, it's
That's
not
good.
great. It's not great, but it's tolerable, And if you dilute it with enough water, it's not too bad. The flavor they have is called Scary Cherry, and it's not even that much cherry, but it's not that scary anymore compared to what it was.
Right.
And then there's another one. So Dr. Veach worked with Dr. Kieran Clark in Oxford. She had studied athletes, extensively with the ketone ester too before it came out. And she has a company called Delta G that has also sells the ketone ester, and just different flavors of it. And they have, I think, one's for health and one's for athletes, and they have different formulations of it. And then there are other companies that have some esters and some mixtures of that are out. They've been kind of coming along. Cognitive Switch is a really interesting ester. Well, like Dr. Veach's ester is a mixture of beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the ketone that you produce from fat in your body, and butanediol, which it's an alcohol, but it breaks down to more beta hydroxybutyrate, which is really a brilliant idea. So his idea was to combine beta hydroxybutyrate in a molecule with butanediol. It becomes an ester so that you don't have the alcohol effect, but when you metabolize it, it all breaks down to beta hydroxybutyrate. So you have this ketone that's helping to make ATP. And he thought that would help sustain it longer too. If you just take, he was worried if you took large quantities of just the beta hydroxybutyrate as an acid, that it would be too acidic for your stomach, that it could cause ulcers, or bleeding or something like that. So that's why he wanted to develop this ester. But now there's some products out that are free beta hydroxybutyrate, but they buffer it. They put a buffer in to make it less acidic. So that's kind of a way around it. But the doses are also much smaller too in those products than what my husband was getting. They'll be like usually 10 grams in a serving instead of 25. And they're pretty interesting. Carbonated beverages. Prove It has one. There's a company called Kinetic that's just come out with a bunch of flavors of it. Kinetic also has, and a couple companies, well, I think Kinetic's the main one, has a mixture of beta hydroxybutyrate free acid and butanediol. And so they're, instead of being attached, the molecules at ester, they're together as a mixture. And, that one is really interesting. It's the flavors they have are kind of citrusy flavors. It doesn't taste as bad as the ketone ester. And then this Cognitive Switch, they have a molecule where they combine C8, the MCT, with butanediol, the alcohol, as a molecule, and it's an ester, and it's remarkably tastes good.
Wow.
They have a liquid product that tastes really good, and then they have a flavorless powder that you can mix it into coffee or tea or just in water, and it really is almost flavorless. I mean, there's a tiny, tiny bit of bitterness. And so if you put it in coffee, which is already bitter, it kind of almost disappears, So there's a number of products out there now. And then the ketone salts. Are you familiar with the ketone salts?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So they came out in 2016, and they were developed at the lab of Dr. Dominic D'Agostino in the University of South Florida. And then first, the Prove It company came out. They were the first ones that really come out with it. They were really, have been really into education, about all of this. They have a ton of flavors, and a whole bunch of other companies have come out with ketone salts, in the meantime. Keto Start, from Audacious Nutrition, I don't know. There's just a bunch of them. So there are a whole lot of products, all different price ranges too, for these products. So, I think I have on my website, I have information about the different supplements, a little bit of what are the differences between them and kind of what the price points are. And, some people, they want more variety, so they might go with like Prove It that has a ton of different flavors available, and they have carbonated drinks, and they have powder, or, sometimes a very simple, product with, they might have one or two products, they'll be less expensive, but, basically have a similar effect, so people just need to find their price point. And, with, Alzheimer's, older people, aging, people get age-related memory impairment. There's a gap in brain energy where your brain isn't getting as much energy as it needs. And this has been documented with ketone and glucose PET scans. Dr. Stephen Cunane has done a lot of work on this. You can fill in that gap with ketones. He's been able to show this with MCT oil and with ketone salts, that you can fill in this deficit in brain energy that you have, even just from normal aging, by taking, these ketogenic oils or exogenous ketones. So, but, I don't know. I just like to let people know about all the possibilities so they could kind of investigate themselves and figure out what meets their needs, and, how they can fit it into their budget.
Yeah, I was prepping for this podcast and looking on the National Institute of Aging's website, in particular, their guides around healthy eating and Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And they have sort of a little infographic visual there describing some of the positive changes that you can make. And I know we've talked a lot about, in particular, MCT oil and coconut oil in this conversation. They recommend switching from solid animal fats to oils. But I do feel like there could be a risk there if people think all oils are created equally.
Yeah.
Would you be able to speak a little bit about maybe interpreting that with a bit of caution, and just because something's called oil doesn't mean it has the same beneficial aspects of MCT oil or coconut oil?
Yeah. The thing about, all of the everyday oils that people eat have no medium chain triglycerides at all. I mean, unless you're on a ketogenic diet, which means a very low carb diet and a higher fat diet, you aren't normally producing ketones. Those oils aren't usually converted to ketones, so, and this whole thing about avoiding animal fats is, that's the new project I've been working on for about a year and a half now. And we talked about this before we started recording, but I have a paper that just got published on Saturday looking at the dietary guidelines for Americans and are they justified, their guidelines on fat. And I got interested in it because of coconut oil. I mean, it has a reputation as being very high in saturated fat, and it is. But 70% of the saturated fat are these medium chain triglycerides. They're not the same saturated fat that is found in other oils and fats. And, a lot of people don't know that all, MCT oil's kind of different because it's deliberately extracted from coconut oil. But other, things like olive oil, peanut oil, soybean oil, all the typical vegetable oils that people use, they all have some saturated fat in them. It's kind of in about the 11 to 14% range, of saturated fat. Coconut oil, the long chain saturated fats, the same ones, that are in these other oils, is like 11% of those particular fatty acids. It's about the same range as other vegetable oils. So the other saturated fats in coconut oil are these medium chain triglycerides, could be very beneficial, to the brain, basically, and for other health reasons. So I got interested in trying to learn, where did this idea that we should eat a low fat diet and that we should replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, where did that idea come from? And is it justified? Because I grew up, I was born in 1952, and there was a big switch, in the 1950s. We were told to eat margarine instead of butter, and people had been cooking with lard, and beef tallow a lot up, for all of humankind until the 1940s and 1950s. Crisco came along in 1911. It was the first hydrogenated fat. It was cottonseed oil. It might still be cottonseed oil. And when they hydrogenate a fat, they subject it to high heat, high pressure. They inject hydrogen into it, and they use like a catalyst, an enzyme, and it converts it to saturated fat. It converts polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats to saturated fats. But it also creates, they have found something like 18 abnormal molecules that are called trans fats. It causes the molecules to twist. It causes, like there are these like bonds, they call them double bonds. And like a monounsaturated fat has one double bond in the molecule. It's in place of hydrogen ions, so like a saturated fat, all the places in the fat that could have a hydrogen atom do, but when you have a monounsaturated fat, there's a couple of connections between carbon atoms that don't have hydrogen atoms, but they have a stronger bond called a double bond. And polyunsaturated fat have multiple double bonds in them. But these are places where other oxidizing agents can come in and attach to the molecule then. The molecule can become oxidized when you heat it, like when you're frying, something like that. And just over time, the oxygen in the air will oxidize it. And so these fats will become rancid. They're not very shelf stable. And the purpose of hydrogenation, when you cause a fat to become saturated fat, it's more stable because there aren't these double bonds where these obnoxious substances can attach to. Coconut oil is a really stable oil. Its shelf life is at least 2 years, because it is so much saturated fat. It doesn't have places in the fats, for these obnoxious, oxidizing substances to attach to. So Crisco, coconut oil was a major competitor for Crisco. It looked a lot like it. And the whole purpose, of developing a product like Crisco was to greatly increase the shelf life of the product. And so that came around in 1911. And then, they were also creating margarines that were hydrogenated, and they were loaded with trans fat. There were a lot of states in the US that wouldn't even allow margarines to be put on their shelves because of what they were made out of, because they weren't natural, and they knew fairly early that there were these trans fats in them. They just, and there were people, lipid biochemists, that were warning these are harmful, these could be harmful, they could be inflammatory, they weren't, people weren't paying attention to them. The people, the food industry FDA wasn't paying attention to them until, really around 2000, the year 2000. So we had a whole century almost of these fats and oils, shortenings and margarines being in, almost all, US households, and they were worldwide too. I mean, they were widely used, in Europe and other places and Asia. And I'm trying to decide how much you want me to talk about, like this paper that I just wrote. So what I found out, I'll just try to get to the bottom line on it. I, basically looked at all the major studies that were done beginning like in the 1950s. There was an epidemic of heart disease, they thought, that and they mainly affecting middle-aged men. Men were having heart attacks, they were dying, it just seemed like it was a new thing. And President Eisenhower had a heart attack, and that's kind of what triggered a lot of research after that, and awareness of this problem. And there were people, Ansel Keys, he was a physiologist, but he had an interest in nutrition, and he kind of concluded on his own that people were eating more fat, and that it must be the fat that was causing, and it had something to do with increasing cholesterol levels, and that this was causing, people to have a heart attack, mainly middle-aged men they were really worried about. And so he started, he called it the lipid heart hypothesis. He started studying the lipid heart hypothesis. And he did animal studies. There had already been some animal studies with rabbits who are herbivores. They would feed them like egg yolks, which they don't usually ever eat because they eat vegetables. They don't eat eggs. And they would get this buildup of this yellow substance on their arteries. But it also was quite destructive to their other organs. Their liver and their spleen and other organs were affected too. But they thought that this was evidence that cholesterol must be causing heart attacks in men, and they embarked on a series of studies of the lipid heart hypothesis. And what they failed to do was they failed to separate natural sources of saturated fat from these trans fats, these hydrogenated fats. They considered saturated fat solid fat. And these were solid fats, and this included the natural, the butter, lard, beef tallow, and something like, coconut oil. Coconut oil was barely used in the United States. It was, almost nobody was using it. It was like less than 1% of edible oils in the US at the time. Clearly didn't cause heart attacks in US men. But when they did the study, they combined, the natural saturated fats with the trans fats. And they didn't study them separately ever. They would have a group of people that were getting the typical American diet, and they would get all of these solid fats, whether natural or not. And they would have another group in which they replaced the saturated fats with polyunsaturated fat. And the main thing they were looking at in a lot of the studies was just the effect on their cholesterol levels. And they did see when they replaced, saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, the cholesterol levels would go down, at least temporarily. Some of the longer studies, it actually came back up to baseline, or close to it, by the end of the study. So it was a temporary effect. But what they didn't show in any of these studies was that doing this, lowering the cholesterol level in this way had any effect of reducing the number of deaths from heart disease. There was no difference between the groups, in the numbers of deaths from heart disease, except in two studies. And this is really interesting. In the late 60s to early 70s, there were two studies that they were pretty big studies. And one of them went on for 10 years. The other one went on for several years. And they gave a highly polyunsaturated oil, high linoleic acid is the main fatty acid in it. And that the people that got that fat actually had a higher risk of all-cause deaths, premature death, and a higher rate of dying from heart disease. But they didn't publish the results at the time. And one of them, they were using safflower oil to replace saturated fat. And the other one, they were using corn oil to replace saturated fat. They didn't publish them at the time. These were done, sometime in the early 1970s. And a group from the NIH finally, they got the raw data, from these studies, and they published them in 2013 and 2016. But, in the meantime, the dietary guidelines for Americans, the first edition of it came out in 1980. All of this information was available from all of these studies. They had even looked at high versus low fat diets. They didn't even see a difference in cholesterol levels with higher and low fat diets. But yet they started telling us at the end of the 1950s, the American Heart Association came out in 1961 saying we should eat low fat and that we should replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. And that's been their drumbeat ever since. And the dietary guidelines of Americans have followed that too. They say we should eat less than 10% of our fats as 10% of our calories as saturated fat. But they never have come up, with how do they come up with that number? They've never really explained that. But none of the studies, they did see reductions in cholesterol levels, but they never saw a reduction in actual heart disease. Deaths from heart disease. And in most of the studies, they didn't even show a difference in the number of heart attacks. So, the evidence is just not there, that we should eat a low-fat diet. I mean, right away, like in 1961, when the American Heart Association published it, there had only been a few little studies of 10 or 14 people, that had been done, and they were in mental hospitals. They were doing, people that they had to eat. They ate what was given to them. They weren't free living people who had to figure out what to eat every day, like most of us do. And yet they said we should start eating low fat and fat free milk and dairy. This was in the late 1950s. And they've been telling us this ever since, but it was not ever justified. It wasn't proven to be beneficial. They always say it reduces your risk of heart disease, but they're talking about reducing your cholesterol level. They're not talking about reducing your actual likelihood that you're going to die from a heart attack. So that's been my latest obsession. And, that article just came out in Nutrients Journal on Saturday. But we were, Dr. Fabian David, he goes by Toby. He's a chemist, and he trained in the U.S. at Princeton, but he's in Manila in the Philippines. And we co-wrote this. We both have this kind of passion about that these dietary guidelines need to change. And, coconut oil, it's been vilified because it's high in saturated fat. And, for the reasons we talked about, it's really mostly medium chain triglycerides that are beneficial. And it has this lauric acid. It's antimicrobial. I mean, it's just, really an amazing food. And it's unfortunate because, most of the dietary guidelines from the different editions that have come out have said to avoid tropical oils because they're high in saturated fat. But anyway, so we're hoping to influence they're revising this year. They revise every 5 years, and so they have a committee that they accept public comments. So anybody can submit comments, their opinion about what they should do with their dietary guidelines. And so we already submitted several comments, but now we submitted our paper, hoping that they will read it and pay attention to it and review those studies, look at it, for, what they really reported, and reconsider what they're telling us. I mean, they tell people not to eat, animal fat, natural sources of saturated fat. But it's not justified because they never studied it separately. They never studied it separately from hydrogenated, like these industrial fats.
I see you as a very interesting researcher because you've kind of dived deep in terms of mechanisms of action for certain areas of your research, and then in other areas of your research, you've approached the topic from a case study framework of assembling data points manually in order to prove or disprove a hypothesis. And then this latest article of yours, I think, is more approaching it from a meta-analysis perspective, looking at the body of evidence, and in particular, how variables could be tweaked or manipulated in order to produce a study outcome. And the cholesterol point that you mentioned, I think, is so interesting because cholesterol is of multiple components, LDL and HDL. You could reduce total cholesterol serum levels while changing the proportion of LDL and HDL and actually increasing the risk of death. Like, you can reduce total serum level of cholesterol, but if you increase the LDL proportion, that's a higher risk factor for things like atherosclerosis than total cholesterol level itself. So really appreciate you taking kind of like your lifetime of research and practice to be able to look at the bodies of evidence and reassess this data in a new light.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's been a lot of work. I've been working on this particular project for about 1.5 years. I just, more than 150 references, and I get the entire paper. I read the whole thing. A lot of people will read the abstract, the summary, of a study. And a lot of times that doesn't really tell you the whole story. And it's their opinion of what they think happened in the study, and when you read the actual study, you find out, well, it's maybe not quite as impressive as it sounds, the results in the abstract. So I just, make it a practice to read the entire article and really look, closely at the data to see if it really says, what they say that it says. And, like a difference of, when your cholesterol level is, say, 220, and a study shows a difference of less than 1.1 milligram out of 220 milligrams, is that clinically significant? They'll make a big deal. It was statistically significant difference, but is it clinically significant? Does it make any difference, whether you're going to have a heart attack or not? So I've seen studies, like that. I'm working on another paper. I've also been kind of simultaneously looking at this, but this question of does coconut oil increase your cholesterol level? That's a question I constantly get, as you might imagine, because that's what we've been told, all this time. And when they say that, it turns out what they mean is relative to, like, if you ate coconut oil or a polyunsaturated fat, relatively speaking, what would that do to your cholesterol level? Well, the polyunsaturated oils, they do tend to lower your cholesterol. I still am not clear what the mechanism is, why that happens exactly. But compared to coconut oil, it's a generality, though. It's not always the case. Like in the studies, they don't always turn out that way. But it's all relative, So there was a systematic review that was done in 2020, and they looked at 16 studies of comparing coconut oil to other oils. And the way they presented the data, for example, it was relative to the other oil. What was the relative difference in the cholesterol levels? So there was one study where they said coconut oil increased LDL cholesterol by 9 milligrams, but compared to the other oils. But when you look at the study, it actually decreased LDL cholesterol by 14 points. In the actual study, the group that got coconut oil, when they took it, it decreased their cholesterol level by 14, their LDL cholesterol by 14 milligrams, per deciliter. It didn't increase it by 9. It was the other oil decreased it more, than coconut oil did. So it was relative to that, but it did not increase cholesterol level. But that's how they presented it in a graph. Increases cholesterol. And I think there were 6 studies where the coconut oil, the cholesterol levels actually went down with the coconut oil, but they showed it as, that it had increased relative to the other oils that they were studying. So, that's the kind of thing that has gotten a bad rap, for coconut oil. So I'm basically looking at those same studies and the actual data for the coconut oil and publishing, this is what they found. And, basically it can increase, decrease, or not change your cholesterol levels. But the interesting thing is all but one of the studies, it did increase HDL cholesterol, coconut oil. It's consistently, there was just one study that it didn't increase HDL cholesterol. And that's supposed to be a really strong marker, for cardiac health, a lowering of the risk for, cardiac disease, and triglyceride levels too. They, fairly consistently went down, so what I found, a lot of the studies were very short. They were 3 to 6 weeks long. Yeah. And I would say, I think it was most of the studies were 3 to 6 weeks long. And they decided that it stabilizes, your cholesterol levels stabilize after that short period of time, but they don't. They don't. It's not long enough to study that and say that this is what it permanently does to your cholesterol level, if you keep eating it. So I kind of grouped the studies by short, medium, and long, and medium duration were like 8 to 15 weeks. And then there was one study that went for 2 years. And this was a particularly interesting and really helpful study because they had 200 people in the study, mostly men, and they were people that had already had a heart problem, that they had to have a stent or they had bypass surgery, and they were all on statins, and they gave them, half of the people got sunflower oil. It was almost 3 tablespoons a day, and the other half got coconut oil, almost 3 tablespoons a day, for 2 years. And they had studies drawn at 3 months, which was real helpful. And then at 1 year and 2 years, they had levels that were drawn. And even at 3 months, there was no increase in cholesterol level at all. I mean, it was almost the same. Their levels were almost the same. LDL total, HDL, triglycerides were almost the same at 3 months and at 1 year and at 2 years. Their HDL actually was higher. That was the one thing that was higher, but was it statistically different? It wasn't even that much different. Sunflower oil didn't show that it had lowered, it should have, theoretically lowered the cholesterol levels, but it didn't. It basically, they had the same levels, again, almost the same levels at 3 months, 1 year and 2 years, as they did at baseline before they started taking the oil. And they were just like given the oil to take home and just incorporate into their food. They didn't get any other instruction, what to do with their diet. So it may be like if somebody has their cholesterol level goes up, it may just be a temporary effect, if that happens. And if it goes down, it might just be a temporary effect and come back up to what your set point is. It could be, our liver kind of makes what we don't eat. The cholesterol we don't eat, the liver makes up for it. And most of it's actually produced in the liver, but every cell can produce cholesterol if it needs it. And so I kind of think we have more of a genetic set point for what our cholesterol levels are. That's maybe a little bit influenced by what we eat, up and down a little bit. So that's the next paper, but that's going to be a little while till that one comes out, I think.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Newport, thank you so much for your time today. I see we're coming up on time here. Thank you so much for sharing your story about your husband and his battle with Alzheimer's disease and the treatment protocol that you pioneered, I would say, with the coconut oil. And then also thank you so much for all the research that you're doing on all of these other oils and what the causes and effects are of various different things. Especially, having to do with, our hearts and our general health. So, Ryan, any further announcements before we wrap up?
Just wanted to give you the opportunity, Dr. Newport, to plug any of your books, your website, or particular research articles that you want to share with the audience.
Yeah. Okay. So my website it's coconutketones.com. What a surprise. So it's COCONUTKETONES. There's no Y in ketones. So coconutketones.com. And I put it up for informational purposes right at the end of 2008. It still has a lot of information. I mean, you can print out, a lot of information for free, a lot of videos on there. I have been kind of adding the scientific articles as they come along. Information about products, that a variety, I used a bunch of different ones myself. I don't favorite any one of them. I think that people can experiment for themselves and find what might work for them. And we have a contact on there. My sister Angela helps field some of my email, but people that want information can contact us, or if they just want to give us some good news, we'd like to hear that too. Some people will reach us that way and update us, about their response. And we get some really interesting, updates like that from people about how they're doing. And I do have links to my books, and I've got pretty many books now. Okay. This is, my first book came out in 2011. It's called Alzheimer's Disease, What If There Was a Cure? The Story of Ketones. And this is the third edition that just came out in September of last year. So you can find it on Amazon, a whole lot of other bookstores. And then the year before that, this was my pandemic project. It's called Clearly Keto for Healthy Brain Aging and Alzheimer's Prevention. And this one is, it goes into basically the rationale, all about diabetes, prediabetes, this problem of insulin resistance that so many people are affected by, and how ketones can help overcome that. And a Mediterranean ketogenic diet, whole food diet, it talks extensively about each of the food groups and the importance of each of them. But then a lot of other things that you can do, other ketogenic strategies. Overnight fasting is a way to get into ketosis. A lot of people are doing it these days. exercise stimulates ketone production. So it talks about, other strategies like that, each of the different kinds of exogenous ketones, and then a number of other things that you can do for healthy aging that aren't related to food or ketones. Things to do, things to avoid. So that I think has a lot of information, a lot of good information. And then in 2019, I wrote a book called The Complete Book of Ketones. And this looks more broadly at many different kinds of disorders, using ketogenic diet as an adjunct to cancer treatment, for example. And I have interviews with 16 of the researchers, the pioneers, I call them the pioneers and the rising stars of ketone research, and including Dr. Richard Veach and Dr. George Cahill. I have a story about him. I have some of the others. Dr. Van Italy, he wrote the foreword to this book at age 99. He was the one that discovered that, MCT oil, produces ketones. He passed away right before his 100th birthday. And then I have another, this is probably the easiest book because it's not very big. The other ones are very long. It's called The Coconut Oil and Low Carb Solution for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Other Diseases. And it was kind of meant as a companion. It's simpler on the science. It gets much more into how to incorporate coconut and MCT oil into your diet and how to make that a low carb diet, a low carb whole food diet. It's really similar to a Mediterranean diet. I just didn't call it that in that book yet, but it's probably the easiest one for people to absorb. It mentions the exogenous ketones, but they weren't out yet in 2015 when the book was published. So the other books since then go into a lot more detail about what are ketone salts, what problems could you have, and how to try to avoid those kind of problems. Low blood sugar. If you're somebody who has diabetes and you're taking insulin and you go on a very low carb diet, your blood sugar is going to go way down. So you need to know about that and you need to monitor it. It's got that kind of information in it. So those are my books. And I really appreciate, you letting me go on and on and on here. And it's not often that I really get to talk about everything I'd like to talk about. So I really appreciate it. And I wonder how many people are still listening at this point. But I appreciate it, anybody who wants this information. So, and I thank you very much for inviting me, to be on your program.
Of course. Yeah, we appreciate your time and offering your expertise and just your lifetime of work, both from a professional as well as a personal point of view, just the challenges you've been able to face and meet with success and teach people and actually influence people's lives for the better. So we're really grateful that you were able to come on today. And we love giving people the opportunity to speak freely because you never know what they might say. Some people tell a story for the first time, or you just published a research article, so you had the opportunity to speak about that. So we're very grateful for your presence.
Yeah, I thank you. I thank you for helping me to spread this message, and thank you to everybody listening.
Thank you, Dr. Newport.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.